So today I'm going to talk about variables and operators in programming languages. So what is a programming language? Oh, yeah. How many languages do you need to know? So programming languages or programming language is yet another language. Programming language is part math as you use symbols and variables. Programming language is also writing as you write full sentences and statements. So it's not quite like English sentences, but close to it. So these are called statements, not sentences, but they're much like English sentences. So let us start with the math part. Within that, let us start with algebra. And algebra starts with variables. So what are variables in algebra? They are kind of like placeholders. So here I say x is a variable, plus is an operator, y is another variable. So when x and y are added, the result is z. So really what you put in x gets added to what is put in y, and the value is put in another place labeled by z. So you can have these values, x can be 1, x can be 2, x can be 3, and the result will be the sum of the value of these two variables. Doesn't really matter whether it's a positive number or negative number. There is a limit on the number size that you can have. In computer, it has to be a finite size. On paper also, you can write as big as you want, but somehow you are limited by the size of the paper or something like that. So it has to be finite, but it can be very large. Because programming languages are both math and language, we have to tell if a letter, when I use a letter, whether it's a letter in the alphabet or it is a variable. Some programming languages like Python can figure it out, but others like Java and JavaScript cannot. So Python is pretty much like algebra. You can just say x equals 1, y equals 3, and y equals 2, and z will be 3. But in Java and JavaScript, slightly older languages, you have to say var, which is a keyword, a short for variable. So that way, the computer knows you are talking about a variable x, not just the letter x. So if I say this is a program, that a is a part of an English sentence. That is different from a variable a when I assign values to it. Also note another interesting difference. In algebra, variables can take numbers for values, but programming language variables can take letter for values. It can even take words. So the values for a variable doesn't have to be just numbers in programming languages. So also note another interesting difference. Variable a equals a. So what is the difference between this a and that a? So this a is surrounded by quotes. So that is the difference. When this is a value, it has to be surrounded by quotes. When it's just a variable name, it doesn't have to be surrounded by anything. Okay, so also note another interesting difference. Variable a can have value a, it can have a value x, both works because it doesn't have to be the same as a variable name. Variable name is just a name. It can also be variable a equals a, variable var a equals 2, that works. But what we cannot do is that we cannot use the same variable name twice within the same program. Then we have to use different variable names. We can also say var a equals 1 and var b equals 1 also. That works because those are just values, just not the same name here and the same name here. Okay, so in Python, I can do that. I can assign a value of a letter to a variable and a numerical value. Sorry, we're talking about calculator, not Python quite yet. But in calculator, you cannot really do that because you can only enter a number. There is no way you can enter a letter. In Python, you can do that. Result will not be what you expect to see. This happens because inside the computer, even the letters are stored as numbers. That way, there is a numerical value for each character. So if you add that, so the value for lowercase a is 97. If you add that with 3, the result will be 100. But that is not what you want to see. Generally, you don't want to see characters being added to numbers. But there are times when people really want to do it and do it intentionally. So in Python, that will be the case. In Java, it'll be the same thing. There has to be a var in front of this z here, because in Java, you need this keyword that is missing here somehow, but that should be here. But in Python, you don't. So in Python, you can add this too. In Java, you can use the keyword var, then you will see that result. But if you really want to prohibit a variable being assigned to a character and then add it to an integer, then you can do this. This is called declaring the variable type in addition to declaring, saying that this x, which is a variable name, is a variable. Here we are more specific. We're saying that it can only take an integer value. It cannot take any other value. So that way, if you try to assign a letter to it, it'll throw errors. So it's not going to work, and you will not get a result like this. Okay, so this is from a real Java program. We declared two variables, var a, var b, and assigned values, and printed the result. And here is the result. But if I try to use the same variable names again, it's just showing this red line here, this red X marks here. That means it's not the right thing to do. It's not compiling, it's checking, syntax checking. So the compiler checks for syntax. It's more like what Grammarly does, like grammar check. Once a program compiles, there is no grammatical error, then the program executes and then produces the result it produces. So compiling will precede execution, and once the compiler passes the program, it will just run. Sometimes it runs by itself, other times you have to compile and run separately, but modern days mostly it's just one step. That's what I have for now. We can go in more detail. Obviously we can go, and we have to go if you really have to work with a real programming language, but this is just an introduction to what is variables, what are variables in programming languages.